folks could chime in and let me know, maybe by raising hands, whether or not that's true. That would be really helpful for me, because it helps me to determine then how deep to go, or if I can just leap over and assume that you all know the basics.
You can also type that into the chat button. We just proceed.
Okay. So what I needed to let you know is, from my perspective, as I look at your mission and your mandate, one of the things that's really struck me is this growing interest and growing awareness about the need to really be more mindful as a society around how we're caring for folks, people of all ages, certainly the elderly, but not exclusively limited to the elderly. We do know from recent Angus Reid survey, for example, that 32% of Canadians report a strong sense of belonging, but at the same time, 38% of Canadians report that they don't feel like they have a stake in their local community. And what this research is also pointing out is that people who don't feel connected to their own community actually don't work for the common good. Similarly, more recent estimates are projecting that 1 in 5 older Canadians would describe themselves as lonely or dissatisfied with life. And similarly, not quite shockingly actually, 64% of Canadians that are post-secondary students also report feeling very, very lonely in the last 12 months. And so one of the things that, certainly if you're looking at a national policy lens, this is one of those environmental pieces that I think helps set the context that you will be working in. And for this reason, I think, having a network like yours that can take a look at how to come together, work across sectors, and really advance an agenda to begin to address some of these issues is pivotal. For those of you who don't know, collective impact formally kind of jumped into the radar of most people in the winter of 2011, when the Stanford Social Innovation Review published a paper called Collective Impact that had been co-authored by 2 consultants from a firm in the US called FSG, John Kenya and his colleague Mark Kramer. And what I find particularly interesting is the backstory behind how this paper came to be. And the backstory is that the consulting team at FSG had been hired by a philanthropy network. And the research question that they were given was, across this network, the members had been investing in a number of different programs and services for more than a decade. And the question they kept coming back to when we're having trouble answering for themselves was, what impact has this investment had? And so they commissioned Kenya and Kramer and the folks at FSG to go off and do that research. Off they went. And when they came back, they were able to tell the philanthropy network that, for the most part, 80% of the time, the investments made in various programs and initiatives did have a positive impact, but that impact was almost always limited to the people who were fortunate enough to be recipients of programs and services that had been funded. But beyond those programs and services, very little had changed. But in doing the research, Kenya and Kramer also came across a small number of what they would call outliers. And these were projects that had gone way beyond just having a positive benefit for a particular population of people, and had actually shown real initiative in people's ability to actually move way beyond a program or a service and shift an entire system. And I think that was the big thing that caught their attention. So with a little more intentionality, they went back and they looked at this small number of outlier grants. And what they wanted to find out is, what were those grantees doing that was so fundamentally different than their colleagues that was resulting in this broader systems change? And the 5 conditions and 3 preconditions of collective impact come from their ability to look across that diversity of projects and distill out some common patterns and common approaches that these projects had embraced that made them stand out. Now, I can quickly go through each of the 5 conditions of collective impact, but what I will say is the definition for collective impact as was initially published is it is a disciplined cross-sector approach to solving complex social and environmental issues on a large scale. I think for me, there's been lots and lots and lots of collaboration. What makes collective impact distinct from other forms of collaboration, in my mind, is 2 things. The first is that absolute emphasis that the collaboration needs to span across multiple sectors. I'm sure many of you would be familiar, as am I, that most of the collaborations I've seen tend to stay within one particular sector. It might be better alignment around different levels of a healthcare system, but it's almost always health-focused. Similarly, community focus, community service focus. Rarely do you see kind of an intermingling of those 2. And collective impact is different because it's saying we want everyone who is affected by this issue to have a seat around the table, helping us to look at and understand this particular issue more deeply and therefore generate many more innovative solutions connected to it. So, obviously, not surprisingly, as collective impact has gained momentum, if we can just keep leaping over. Next slide. I know where I am now. Thank you so much, Benedictine.
I was trying to figure out where we were.
Okay, keep going, keep going. And I've sent this as a PDF as well, so you'll have this. Keep going to the next one. Right up to where you see the definition of collective impact, and then go one more.
There we go.
That. Next one.
Next one.
Okay, so what I want to do, not surprisingly, and this one has a couple of clicks after because there's 2 triangles that will come up on the screen. There you go. And the next one, there's 2 more clicks, I think, and then there's the red box. So I guess what I want to say to you is that while collective impact, while this notion of collaboration is not necessarily new, that it is a unique and disciplined form. So the red box on the screen is sort of the area of a continuum of collaborative options where you would expect collective impact to embed itself or embrace itself. So what it's saying is, there's a whole range of options. Collaboration isn't always the right thing to be doing given a particular situation and issue. And even if you do choose to collaborate, collective impact is just one unique form of collaboration around a range of potential options. So if we can go to the next slide. The big piece for me is if you want to know then when does it make sense to use collective impact as a form of collaboration and when not, the marker is always that the issue that you're trying to address is a complex one. When the issue is complex, collective impact as a discipline framework is a very effective approach. Go to the next slide. I'm not sure if we can click all the way through, Benedictine. There's good. I'm not sure how many of you may or may not be familiar with the work of Brenda Zimmerman. She was a professor at the Schulich School of Business and did a lot in healthcare management. One of the gifts that she gave to all of us who are kind of looking at tough, complex issues is to help us recognize that not all issues are the same. Not all problems are the same. And in fact, the solutions that you would use to address a problem really depend on that definition. She actually helped us to break problems apart into 3 distinct kind of buckets. The first being a simple problem. So that's where we already know the answer. For me, hand washing is an excellent example. It doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter where you are. If you wash your hands, you will prevent the spread of disease. Complicated problems are a little bit like the simple problems, but just with more component parts. Knowable is the way that this kind of a complicated problem is often defined. So, for me, the analogy that works really well when I think about a complicated problem is putting on a play. I know what the fundamental pieces are. You need to have a good script. You need to have actors. You need to have a director. You need to have lighting. You need to have props. You need to have costumes. We all know what those component pieces are. Each different play you put on, you kind of have to figure out and tweak those core pieces, but it's a knowable thing. So if you get asked to put on a play, there is a formula you can put in place and reliably get the kind of output that you're hoping for. Complex problems are a very different kind of problem than the other two, in that they are dynamic. So what that means is, there's different components impacted by this issue. It's not easy to draw a circle around it and say, okay, here's where the issue is and here's where it isn't. And even if you were able to neatly draw a circle around the issue you're trying to address, the component pieces within that system aren't being static. And so the solution that may have worked 6 months ago won't work necessarily now. The big takeaway is, the big analogy for understanding a complex problem is raising a child. And so any of you who are parents, you know this, right? You've got the parenting manual. It only helps so far, because some of it you just have to kind of figure out as you get to know that particular child. And sure enough, the moment you get your parenting strategy figured out for child number one, along comes child number two, and they require a whole different set of strategies. That's the hard to define, hard to scope, that's the realm of complex. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. So the key here is, when you're dealing with a complex system, you really are not trying to write a rule book with all the different detailed pieces all mapped out in advance, because there's no way you can predict. But if we look to nature, and birds in particular, they give us a really good inkling around a different approach to addressing a complex problem. So birds intuitively know how to fly well in a flock. And what scientists have discovered is that really there are simple rules that are hardwired into the brains of birds that enable them to work effectively as a flock. And the three simple rules that guide them are: gotta fly as fast as the birds beside me, gotta keep an adequate distance between myself and the birds on either side of me, and I always gotta fly into the center. Similarly, a hotel chain that had embraced exemplary customer service as their #1 strategic priority used a similar simple rules approach to how they were going to execute this strategy. You can imagine one approach would have been, if they'd seen it as a complicated problem, they would have tried to anticipate and write a 1,000-page rule book for every kind of scenario that might show up and give people clear direction on how to respond. But there's no way that that would have been effective or reasonable. And so instead what they did was they embraced 3 simple rules that they kind of hammered home to all staff in their international network. #1, exemplary customer service is our #1 consideration. #2, each and every one of you has an obligation and a responsibility to help us fulfill on this objective. And thirdly, if you come across any client at any time who has a need, doesn't matter what position you hold in the organization, it is your role to navigate the hotel and find that client the answer or solution that they need, and make sure that it gets delivered back to them. So in that way, they've given people a reliable set of rules to help them navigate in times of uncertainty. And that's ultimately what you're looking for in complexity. If we can go to the next slide. So if collective impact is an approach that works really well in complexity, what were those patterns that the outlier projects that had been so effective at shifting systems, what were some of those patterns? Well, first of all, Kenya and Kramer identified 3 preconditions, which they haven't subsequently written much about, but I think it's useful if you're trying to assess the work of your network and how to strengthen it to take and embrace a real collective impact approach around how you execute for getting your work done. The first is that you need to look and see, do you have influential champions around your table? And these are champions in multiple sectors, but who know, understand, feel passionate, and are committed to working alongside you to advance your issue. The urgency of the issue is the second sort of area of assessment that you need to do, which is, you folks live and breathe your issue every day, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone in the public feels as you do. Therefore, you need to do an honest assessment of how does the issue of elder care kind of fit on the radar of the general public. If it isn't where you want it to be, then what are your strategies for helping to make this case more prevalent in the eyes and the minds of the public? You may find as well that if a lot of the work that you're going to be focused on is legislative in nature, then where the audience you really have to be tracking as well are the political folks, and where are they with respect to your issue? And lastly, the third precondition to successfully implement a collective impact approach is you need to have adequate resources. And yes, certainly, adequate resources does mean money, but it also means a lot more than money, right? What it really means is that you have people who have in-kind support, skills, talents, time that they can donate and contribute to your issue. Okay, can we go to the next one, please? So here are the 5 conditions of collective impact that Kenya and Kramer teased out. And I'm just going to go through each one, highlighting a couple of important points before kind of really zeroing in on this notion of backbone support, which is the 5th, because I understand that the work of the network really kind of dovetails nicely there the most. So the common agenda is the first of the 5 preconditions, or excuse me, 5 conditions of collective impact. And so what this is across that diverse network of folks you've gathered around the table to work on your issue, you have reached agreement on the shared vision for the change that you're hoping to advance. And as importantly, you've dialogued and learned enough from each other's perspective that you've landed on a common understanding and joint approach for how you are going to solve or address the issue that you want to work on together. Shared measurement is the second of the 5 conditions, and I think this is one of the areas where collective impact really does distinguish itself from other forms of collaboration. What it is saying is that as a diverse network with agreement around your shared vision and joint approach, you've also identified key measures, not a huge laundry list of them, but key measures that you are going to be consistently measuring and tracking so that you together have a good sense of whether the innovations that you're working on together are having the impact that you hope that they will. And if they're not, how you need to adapt or adjust your strategy. The other place where, for me, shared measurement really comes into play is around also guiding and shaping your common agenda. So you're looking at what is the data telling you? Are there particular pockets of the country where elders are thriving more than others, and what can we learn from that? Or are there particular areas where we would want to focus our attention first from a policy perspective, and why? So data can also help inform how you get started and where you start in terms of implementing your collective impact effort. Mutually reinforcing activities is the third. And so what this is saying is across that diverse multi-sectoral partnership, you all have begun to have a deeper understanding of the work that each of the respective partners is contributing to this issue and work and the networks that they have within the system. And you are becoming really clear across this network of partners how to better leverage the individual work that you are doing in a way that aligns together towards the same shared common agenda. Continuous communication is the fourth of the 5 conditions. And so what this is really recognizing is collective impact involves multiple players from different sectors working together. It does not necessarily need to lead to the creation of a net new organization to get that work done. And so because it isn't an organization, we can't necessarily rely on established communications infrastructure to enable the partners to communicate well with each other. So it's on one level, really amongst these diverse partners taking the time to create a shared language and make sure that when you're talking about elders, you are all talking about the same age cohort. It's as basic as that. And then also clear agreements around how you share information back and forth with each other. The second layer of continuous communication for me is recognizing that each one of the leaders of a collective impact effort has connections back to different organizations and networks, being really intentional about how do those members then carry back what they're learning from the collective impact table and use it to both keep their respective organizations informed, engaged in the work that's unfolding through the collaborative. And then finally, knowing that at the end of the day, collective impact efforts are almost always about acting in service to the community as a whole. So then the third layer of continuous communication really pays attention to how are we communicating back to the public the impact about what we're learning and also the progress we're making on innovating new approaches to address the issue that we are rallying around. Backbone support is the fifth of the 5 conditions. And really, what it's acknowledging is, as I said earlier, a collective impact table, collaborative table, isn't an organization, nor should it be. So you have to really think about what are those core functions, what's the minimum sort of support needed to advance the work efficiently and effectively. And that's where I think I'd like to spend the rest of the time I have with you, just kind of laying out in more depth that role in particular. If you can go to the next slide, please. So I want to start by kind of giving you a better sense of some possible models, building blocks for creating, for the backbone role in a collective impact effort. If you can go to the next one. So lots has been written about this function. And in fact, the folks at FSG and others have further fleshed out the notion of a backbone. And it shouldn't necessarily be organizations. I think it's evolved to a backbone infrastructure. You'll see these are the 6 core responsibilities that the backbone plays. So absolutely, they're the holders of the meta strategy. It's not uncommon in a collective impact effort for a number of action groups or action tables to form around a variety of different priorities within the common agenda. And so there needs to be a quarterback who's kind of keeping an eye on all of the different work that's happening simultaneously, knowing when to braid it back together and when to allow different projects to kind of lead forward. Oftentimes, the backbone is also the holder of those metrics and the monitoring system, the sense-making opportunities that are created across the network to help interpret what that data means. And establishes those measurement practices. Oftentimes, they will lean in and bring in, when appropriate, the skills of epidemiologists to help them sift through things and choose indicators that align most with the shared, the common agenda that they're working on. They're often the holders and key spokespeople for the collaborative effort. They do absolutely look at and advance the policy agenda, and they also are taking an eye on how to mobilize collective funding to support the effort overall. And so I think this quote at the bottom is really critical. When you are playing this role, you are in a place of tension between coordinating and maintaining accountability across specific working groups, and yet at the same time working behind the scenes to make sure that there is shared ownership for the initiative overall and the work that's being done. Okay, you jump to the next one. Lots of lessons already. From research, absolutely, this is a collective impact effort doesn't work without thought, intentional thought given to creating a strong backbone. But the focus of the backbone will change over time as a collaborative initiative matures and shifts and changes. The organizational partners are going to need, for example, ongoing assistance with data, so you may need to have some strong expertise in data or epidemiology to support your effort. And building public will is an ongoing challenge and important role that backbones play. Next slide, please. Lots of misperceptions about the backbone. The most common one that we're seeing a lot of is, as the landscape is shifting and collective impact has been gaining popularity, lots of organizations rebranding the work that they've always done and calling it collective impact, number one, and or lots of jockeying within a community that says, I am the backbone, perceiving that if they designate themselves the backbone, that they will receive all the funding or they will be in charge. And that just isn't the reality in true collective impact efforts. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, so one of the things I want to tell you as well is, as you're thinking about it, there is no one right backbone. So there's lots of examples across multiple fields where different entities have stepped forward to play the backbone role. There are times where funders are the initial catalyst, and they remain the core provision of backbone support for a collective impact effort. You know, in one project that my colleague and I worked on in New Hampshire, for example, the original collective impact effort was established when two foundations decided to convene it. But when they did, they were really clear that they were going to play that coordinator role just until the sector as a whole signed off on a collective impact strategy and framework. Once that was achieved, they wanted the players, the leaders that were kind of bubbling forward to help lead this effort to put out an RFP and hire or choose an organization in the community to assume the backbone role. There also have been situations where a new nonprofit is established to serve as the backbone in a collaborative effort. Most often, it's because there isn't a natural and logical other option in the community. The Headwaters Communities in Action group that is here, I'm quite familiar with, and know that in the rural community where this is based, there is no community foundation. There is no United Way presence that's very strong, and therefore there wasn't any natural new entity or natural sort of affinity where this work could be nested out of. Sometimes it goes to an existing nonprofit, sometimes it's a government agency, and sometimes the role of the backbone is actually shared across multiple agencies. Okay, next slide, please. So, overarching, lots of ways to get to selecting your backbone. I'm not going to go through all of them. I just want you to see that, you know, it can go all the way from an open process on one end to a predetermined process. And not surprisingly, depending on the options that you choose, there are both advantages and disadvantages to each option. So it's really about being intentional and mindful about what works best in your own context. Okay, next slide, please. So when you're thinking about the context and trying to assess what kind of backbone would make the most sense, you really have to spend time rooting it in your own reality. You know, understanding the context that you are in. Who are the people? What kind of relationships of trust have they created across the sector? Those kinds of things are all critical in making the right choice for your effort around the kind of backbone entity to establish. Next slide, please. All right, so now what I'm going to do is give you a couple of options that we've seen out there in the world. So often, one kind of approach to a backbone is really taking a focus on an issue. In this case, let's talk about educational achievement, and then really the backbone is kind of comes together by kind of pulling along the entire spectrum or continuum. So, you know, there might be a collaborative working on high school graduation rates, there might be another one on early years, there might be another one on college readiness, and really the backbone role is around sort of coordinating the efforts across all three. Because obviously there's intersection points between and amongst them, and they can get a lot more oomph if they're kind of aware of that and leveraging that going forward. Okay, next slide. My colleague Liz Weaver, who is now the Vice President at Tamarack, was for many years the lead staff person at the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. And this is sort of how they envisioned their role. They looked at the poverty data in Hamilton and recognized that the majority of folks living in poverty in Hamilton at the time were young children. That's how they kind of understood the issue, and they framed their common agenda around an aspiration of making their city the best place to raise a child. Because there were already established collaborative tables working in a number of the sub areas like quality early learning or parenting, the 0 to 6 table, there was lots around education and recreation. All of these different collaborative tables existed. What the round table saw its role as being is to help each one of the tables to connect to each other and understand the role that that table played in addressing the issue of poverty, and conversely, how poverty affected the issues that each one of them cared about. So how to use the lens of poverty to assess their work going forward. And then played a coordinating role monitoring and tracking that progress over time. Next slide, please. Sometimes what you see is a community-focused collective impact effort. So there's a number of core issues, but the geography is tightly defined. If you can go to the next slide. And this one, I think, is the one that might appeal most to your own context. So this is where you have a system-focused backbone that's working across multiple scales. So what you've got is a number of local efforts that are collaborative perhaps and underway. There's some kind of backbone coordination support that enables these locals to learn from and see how each other is operating, and then play a role around advancing a national or statewide agenda on that issue and playing that conduit role between the national perspective and those local perspectives. Okay, next one. So a great example of that is the work that Tamarack has advanced around our Vibrant Communities Poverty Reduction effort, where Tamarack actually played the national backbone organization role. So the focus was on poverty reduction. These were the 4 core elements of what was unique about how Vibrant Communities was going to address this issue. They were committed to working across sectors. They were really committed to embracing a notion of community learning and change, focusing on building of assets, and really challenging one another to comprehensively think differently about the nature of poverty and what options might exist for addressing it. Can you go to the next slide? So let me then talk a little bit about some of the things that we know about governance frameworks to guide these kinds of collaborative efforts, because as I said, they're not organizations. If we can go to the next slide. So really what we're seeing is 4 general types. So the first is a standalone legal charity, and it sounds like from your own AGM that you're working towards establishing charitable status for yourself, and so that might actually fit well for you. The second type is that you have a large staff team of 5 or more, but they are based within a host organization. The staff team really leads the initiative and has support from an advisory committee. The third option is a small staff team of 0 to 3 inside a host organization, and they work collaboratively with a volunteer steering committee, and they may also have a larger advisory committee as well. And so type 4 we're saying is other, because you know what? The landscape is changing around this all the time, and there's not one right answer. I think a lot of the thinking around collaborative governance has been impacted by the work coming out of Toronto's Centre for Social Innovation. And this is like a really nice way to think about how you structure both for intentionality, but also leave room for adaptability when the issue that you're working on is so dynamic. So, you've got the steering committee, you've got a backbone organization, which is, the core staff people that work closely with the overarching steering committee. And then what you establish are a number of different working groups, the chairs of whom are represented on the steering committee. But once the work of a working group is done, that work group can disband, and that creates some energy to perhaps establish a next working group. So it's really about sort of seeing some of the working groups as being time limited, but always connected in. And the role of the steering committee is to keep an eye on the whole. Okay? Not sure if it can go forward. There you go. So the big piece is to keep in mind when you're thinking about governance of a collaborative initiative is to make sure that you have an aspiration that really speaks to people and is positively focused and inspires a movement almost of followers. You need to have guiding frameworks, and then you need to have your theory of change or framework for change, where your group together has mapped out what you think it's going to take for you to realize your shared aspiration. You need clean technical agreements around memorandums of understanding, terms of reference, and mechanisms to resolve conflicts when they arise. You really want to focus on being clear about decision-making and membership, funding, communicating and reporting policies and procedures. But the big issue is you don't want to overdo. You don't want to overdo your governance pieces because this work is very evolutionary and emergent, and you want to be able to adapt and not tie yourselves down so much that you can't adapt to new changes on the horizon. Next slide. So just going to speak quickly, lastly, on this notion of systems leadership, because it really is taking a system-wide view. I think one of the most powerful things I heard John Kania say was, you know, frustratingly, we've been historically investing in the delivery of programs and being really frustrated that the system didn't change. But in fact, the reality is that's not what those programs were intended for in the first place. So that if what you really want to do is ensure that systems change happens, then you need to be very intentional about developing strategies to achieve that. And there's 4 core strategies for how systems change happens. I'm just going to recap these quickly. So the number 1 thing is increased coordination. So you have a better sense across the different members of what each one of you is doing and how to better coordinate amongst yourselves and leverage and realign yourselves to overall provide better service around your issue. The second piece is learning through prototyping. These are what I call safe fail experiments. So together as partners, when you see a gap, rather than one program trying to fill it individually, you really start working collaboratively as partners for how you might creatively address the filling of this gap together. You know, there's certainly opportunities to enhance existing services that the members of a collective impact effort are offering because they're learning from each other. They are leveraging proven strategies that have worked in one geography and applying them in another one. And then ultimately the 4th core strategy is really taking a look at the policy environment. And that's really asking ourselves, what are the rules that we want to have changed so the innovative ways that we think that new services and programs need to be delivered is given an enabling environment. So it becomes the natural and normal way that things go forward without people even being aware that there was ever another way. Next slide, please. So as leaders of collaborative effort, a backbone, there's been lots of work done to sort of say these are the characteristics that are common to really strong backbone organization leaders. You know, there's lots of paradox there, as you can see. You have to be visionary, but also results-oriented, right? You need to be collaborative and focus on building relationships of trust across a diversity of perspectives. You need to be absolutely focused, but at the same time being adaptive. You need to, because you're not an organization where you can dictate that those below you will do what you say they're going to do, effective backbone leaders are very charismatic and influential because they have to convince people that the innovative way that they're experimenting with is worth trying. You know, savvy politicians on the one hand, but also humble on the other. So yes, lots of paradox. And, you know, sometimes, and that's the power of a group, right? Some of, you know, if you have a really good handle in relationships of trust across a network like yourselves, you know who your visionaries are. You know who your charismatic communicators are. And so it's really about intentionally leveraging those skills to fulfill the leadership role. Okay. Next slide, please. So in a collective impact effort, whole host of different roles that an entity can play. So you really, you know, want to think through, given where your network is at and its maturity and the issues in front of you, how do you want to position yourselves and what role might you want to play in a national collective impact effort? Next slide. And then this is roles that funders, typically like to play in collective impact efforts, it's difficult for them, right? Because the work is very emergent and we can't always guarantee what's going to happen because we're actually experimenting with new approaches. We know enough to know that the way we've always done things is not enough, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee we know what we ought to be doing instead. And so for funders and governments that have greater accountabilities and can sometimes be more risk adverse, these are very strong areas where they can comfortably contribute to a collective impact effort. Okay, next slide. So really, from a funder or government perspective, it's really about how can they amplify the impact of a network, how can they increase the efficiency of resources, and how can they drive alignment between and amongst a variety of players engaged in the effort. Okay, next slide. Lastly, here's the thing. I think Katie and Kramer did the sector a huge service by being so precise and comprehensive in how they mapped out the collective impact framework. The challenge is that's all it is. It's a framework. And having a framework, while very helpful, does not necessarily guarantee or give you the detailed roadmap for how to unfold a collective impact effort in your own sector or around your own issue. So going into it, what you need to be knowing is that a lot of it is relational, and you can't, as my colleague says, change happens at the speed of trust. Those relationships of trust across new players have to be built, and you can't rush that, and always, and that's a key and foundational element of successful collective impact. Next slide, please. All right, my colleagues Liz Weaver and Mark Kabaj recently wrote a paper really saying where is the field of collective impact going next? And they really kind of said, collective impact 1.0 was pre-Kenya and Kramer. Lots of groups were sort of working in this collaborative, unusual way, but didn't have a common language or a common way of articulating what they were doing. Collective Impact 2.0 was really launched when the Stanford Social Innovation Review published Katie and Kramer's paper. So suddenly there's a shared language, there's a framework. People who have been working in this way go, there it is, there it is. They've articulated the way we've been intuitively working. And lots of people who are frustrated with the programmatic approaches and hungry for something new also latched on to this framework as offering really good possibilities. And so Collective Impact 3.0 for us is, as practitioners have been working with the framework in a diversity of issues and settings, we're learning a lot more about what it takes to have these issues be successful. So the field itself is evolving. Next slide. And here is just sort of some of the shifts that my colleagues have sort of begun to identify as needing to be areas of focus as the practice of collective impact moves forward. And I'd be happy to share that article with you if you're interested. Next slide, please. So there you go. I've kind of raced you through a whole whack of stuff, but I will pause here and be happy to take whatever questions that you have.
All right, everyone, you're all unmuted, so if you want to ask a question, now is your time, either over the phone or a microphone or in the chat box. I see Sharon already asked a question. She's asking, are there recommended evaluation tools or questions to include in the evaluation for the framework?
Oh, very good question. What I would direct you to is the folks at FSG have published a 3-part guide on evaluating collective impact efforts. I'd encourage you to take a good look at it. The first really gives you a theoretical understanding. So if you were assuming collective impact efforts are experimenting with net new approaches, so the emphasis is very much on tracking learning and how is what we're learning now through our shared work changing our understanding of the issue and opportunity. The thing that I love most about this 3-part guide is that the third guide actually offers sample indicators that are useful at different phases of the maturity of a collective impact effort. And so I think that would be a really solid guide to help you move forward. Does that deal with your question? Anyone else?
Does anyone else have any questions? Bear in mind, you can always contact Sylvia later. The current webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the website along with the slides. So if you want to review it later and ask her questions later, I will be happy to put you in touch.
Absolutely. In fact, I think my contact info is on the second slide, second or third. So by all means, yes, reach out to me. And then the other thing is, I don't know that I have shared with you, but will certainly, as follow up this call, I will share a PDF of that new article, Collective Impact 3.0, if you want to go a little bit deeper, so you don't have to look around to find it. And if you'd like, I will also include a link to the PDFs, the 3-part guide. Okay, how's that?
That'd be wonderful.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. I really enjoyed this opportunity to be part of your AGM.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Sylvia, this is Pat Power here, the co-chair of the CMPA. I just want to take this opportunity to thank you for this presentation. There's a lot of information in here. We got a taste of it, and I think that was probably the idea, is that we just get a little bit of an understanding and that we can go deeper with other opportunities, either through workshops or webinars that may be available. So I think
absolutely.
Yes, yeah. So that's fantastic. I really appreciate that. I know we're working on a project here in Edmonton. I hope we'll be able to take advantage of some of your material and some of your ideas to do a more credible job.
We're big believers in R&D, rip off and duplicate, and if you need any help or want to be able to access pieces of resources, any one of us, and we're happy to help point you in the right direction.
Okay, thank you again very much for being here. Okay.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Oh.
Bye. Thanks.